Hi, I'm Casey, but most of you know me around the internet as Cartoon12 or ToonCow12 here on YouTube, and as my username suggests, I love cartoons. But even though I prefer animation, that doesn't mean I don't like live-action movies and TV shows either. And as of late, I've had some people ask me what some of my favorite TV shows are and what inspired me to become an artist. I've also seen a lot of people make top 10 lists of their favorite shows and movies, and I find them interesting to listen to, especially if an episode or movie you weren't expecting to make the list pops up, and learning the reasons why he or she likes or hates a particular show or movie. So then I thought, why not make a few top 10 lists of my own? I'd be interested to see how many people agree or disagree with my choices, and if people can point out some things that I might not have considered before. So for this top 10 list, I thought I'd feature one of my favorite live-action TV shows, Star Trek: The Next Generation. Okay, do I have to make an introduction to this? The show's only been on for nearly 30-some years now, and if you're not a fan of Trek, why are you even watching this? Okay, well, just in case there are some curious non-Trekkies in the audience, the original Star Trek was created by Gene Roddenberry back in the 60s and featured a diverse cast of crewmen as they explored the farthest reaches of outer space. So in 1987, a sequel series was finally created, set about 70 years after the original series, and featured a brand new crew aboard a brand new Enterprise. There was the brave and compassionate Captain Picard, his loyal First Officer Commander Riker, Klingon Chief of Security Lieutenant Worf, and an android Lieutenant Commander Data, to name but a few. Out of all the incarnations of Trek, this is the version that I grew up with, and even though it's over 20 years old, I still think it held up pretty well. And much like the original series, it still continued Trek's positive message of mankind putting aside its differences to reach the stars. A future where people weren't judged by appearances and got along with one another, and weren't afraid to explore new worlds and go, well, where no one's gone before. To this day, the show continues to be an inspiration to explorers, activists, scientists, and of course, writers and artists, me included. And since there's over 7 seasons of this show and so many iconic episodes, it was pretty tricky trying to narrow down the list to just my 10 favorites. And keep in mind that this is a list comprised of my personal favorite episodes. Everyone's got their own opinion on what episodes they consider to be the best, and whether you agree or disagree with my choices, I love to hear your feedback. Here it is, my top 10 favorite episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Number 10. Who Watches the Watchers? For the non-Trekkies in the audience, there's this rule that the Federation has called the Prime Directive, which states that if you discover another civilization that doesn't know about life on other worlds and or hasn't invented warp drive yet, you're not allowed to reveal yourself or interfere with the development of their culture. Now, a lot of episodes have dealt with the storyline of what happens when a less developed civilization accidentally discovers Starfleet, but I think this one was the best. Or at least it's my favorite of the bunch. On one of these aforementioned less developed planets, a research team is observing and studying the local natives in secret. But then the reactor explodes, injuring 3 scientists and causing their holographic cloaking device to fail, exposing them to the natives. So the Enterprise crew beams down to help out. They manage to rescue 2 of the scientists, but can't find the 3rd one. Meanwhile, Liko, one of the natives, witnesses the landing party beaming up and is so shocked he falls off a cliff and almost dies. So Dr. Crusher beams him aboard the ship, saves his life, then wipes his memory and returns him home. Unfortunately, the memory wipe didn't totally work, and now Liko's convinced that the legends they gave up years ago are true, and that Captain Picard is their god. Meanwhile, Riker and Troy disguise themselves as the natives and set off to find the last scientist. And is it just me, or is Riker dressed exactly like Flynn Rider from Tangled? But the natives find the scientist first, which makes them believe in God Picard even more. So Flynn Riker escapes with the scientist, but Troy Punzel's trapped and kept behind as a possible sacrifice. So Picard finally decides he has to set the record straight and beams the native leader aboard the ship to prove he's mortal by showing her he can't save one of the scientists from dying. Besides having a good plot and likable characters, that being the Mintakians themselves, this episode is also interesting because it brings up an important point about how we perceive phenomena that's beyond our understanding. This story could have easily made a statement along the lines of saying that God doesn't exist, but thankfully it avoids that question by clearly stating that, well, it's not that deities or other higher forms of life or powers that be don't exist. It's just that you shouldn't let superstition or paranoia turn you into a total irrational being. There's forces and mysteries in the universe that'll most likely never be solved. The crew was simply just trying to tell these people that they weren't one of those forces, and nor should you claim yourself to be. All in all, it's a good story with a very poignant message. Number 9. Darmok. Let's just say that in one fell swoop, this episode brought a whole new meaning to the phrase language barrier. It all starts when the Enterprise tries to make contact with the children of Tama. Although this race is peaceful, no one can make heads or tails of their language. It all just translates as phrases or descriptions of things. So the Tamarians being Captain Picard and their own captain, Dathan, to a nearby planet. Dathan doesn't mean any harm, but this leaves Picard even more confused as to what he's supposed to do. Eventually, the two have to join forces to combat a monster, which ends with Dathan being killed. But the experience finally helps Picard crack the code to the Tamarian language. As it turns out, this race speaks almost entirely in metaphors or images based on their planet's folklore. In one of their stories, two warriors named Darmok and Jalad met at a place called Tanagra and learned to understand one another when they faced a common enemy. So the Tamarians were trying to recreate the story with Picard and Dathan, hoping the same thing would happen. At long last, the Enterprise finally makes contact with the Tamarians, and Picard is left to wonder if he would knowingly sacrifice his life for the sake of making contact with another race. This episode is one of the more famous ones, and for good reason. Even when you can't understand what Dathan's saying, you really learn to like the guy, and it always gets me choked up a bit when he dies. He pays the ultimate price just to make friends with the new culture. And it really puts a new perspective on how we should try to learn and communicate with other countries here on Earth. With a little patience, you'll find many cultures are more similar to one another than you think. It's a very thought-provoking episode that'll have you saying Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra for months on end. Number 8. Loud as a Whisper. Speaking of communication, here's another great example of speaking very little yet saying a lot. The Enterprise is heading to Solaris 5, a planet in the middle of a civil war. To help settle the fighting, they pick up a famous mediator named Riva, who, as it turns out, is completely deaf and uses 3 people with telepathic powers to communicate. He's definitely an inspiring guy who can show people how to use their strengths to the fullest. But things take a turn for the worse when the peace talks go south and a terrorist opens fire on the crowd and kills Riva's assistants. This episode really knows how to build drama and suspense. You can tell this is probably the first time Riva's really felt utterly helpless, and with no words it's obvious how much in a world of pain he's in for losing his friends. And it really makes you wonder just how or if he'll ever succeed in his mission. Thankfully, Troy inspires him to come up with a clever solution. In the end, Riva decides to stay on the planet and teach both factions his sign language in the hopes that both sides will learn to work together and listen to one another. Whether you're handicapped or not, this story is nothing short of inspiring, teaching you, in Riva's words, to turn a disadvantage into an advantage. Number 7. Transfigurations. Now this is kind of odd because the plot for this episode is fairly straightforward, but even though it's simple, it's still an effective little mystery story with a great ending that I think really gets overlooked. So what's the story? The crew comes across a wrecked shuttlecraft and rescue the one person inside. The man has amnesia, so for the time being they call him John Doe. But for how friendly and nice the guy is, we quickly find out he's anything but normal. He soon suffers from fits of pain marked by a glowing energy burst. Realizing he's a threat to the crew, he tries to steal a shuttlecraft and leave, and during the scuffle, Worf actually dies, to which John uses his newfound healing powers to bring him back to life. Eventually, the mystery's finally solved when a ship from John's home planet shows up, demanding that they turn John over to them. When our crew doesn't immediately hand him over, the Zalconian captain uses a paralysis beam to cut off the life support on the ship. But John quickly uses his powers to save the crew, and in the process he finally gets his memory back. As it turns out, he's the first of his people to take the next step of evolution, transforming into a being of pure energy. And his government, fearing these new super beings, tried to kill them all, with John being the only survivor. He then completes his transformation and vows to return to his planet so that others can join him. Now, like I said earlier, this episode's fairly simple, but I think the reason why I liked it a lot is because it kind of reminded me of the plot to the X-Men. The whole special people are mutating and evolving and the normal people fear and hate them deal. Only in this case, the mutant person got more of a happy ending. It's a good lesson in how we should be more welcoming of things that are new and different, and an episode that I think is really underrated. Number 6. Sarek. If you watched my other Top 10 Trek video, then you'll know the original series was actually my favorite incarnation of all the Treks. So in regards to Next Gen, any episode that found ways of bringing back characters from the original series instantly put them on the fave list for me. So this one's a no-brainer, and it's also an important episode in that it's the first major unifying event tying both the old and new Treks together. So what's the plot? Spock's dad, Sarek, Vulcan's ambassador, is about to help establish relations between the Federation and the Ligarians, and the Enterprise is taking him to the meeting site. But while on the way there, some weird stuff starts happening. First, Sarek cries during a music concert, and then various crew members start fighting one another. It's eventually revealed that Sarek's developed Bendai syndrome, a disease that makes elderly Vulcans lose their emotional control, and it's gotten so bad that now he's telepathically projecting that lack of control onto everyone else. This episode is literally an emotional roller coaster ride and nothing short of heartbreaking, as such a great character is forced to confront the fact that he's falling apart at the seams. Any person who's been sick or has had a family member who was sick can relate to this story, especially if that person was too proud to admit they had an illness and needed help. Things all come to a head when the crew has to risk canceling the mission since the Ligarians will only talk to Sarek. So Picard suggests mind melding with him and forming a link so that he can share his mental control with Sarek during the meeting. And what we're treated to is an intense scene of Picard becoming one with Sarek and letting out all the sadness and rage and confessions that Spock's dad kept bottled up for decades. Needless to say, this is a very sensitive episode that drives home the idea that even the greatest of men is subject to illness. Number 5. Unification Parts 1 and 2, but mostly Part 2. There's a reason I put Sarek and Unification right next to each other on the list, because oddly enough, despite one episode being from Season 3, and this one being from Season 5, they actually lead into one another and connect to one another fairly nicely. Now, being that this is a two-parter, which I count as one big episode, there's a lot to cover here and even a bigger backstory that you kinda have to know beforehand, so I'm gonna try my best to give you guys the short version. Ready? Okay, a way long time ago, the Vulcans used to be really emotional and violent until they decided to end the violence and adopt logic and non-emotion as the cornerstone of their civilization. But some of them didn't want to go through with that, so they left the planet and established their own world and civilization. Boom, the Romulans are born. Fast forward years later to the time of the original Trek series, Sarek marries a human woman named Amanda, and they have a half-human, half-Vulcan son, Spock. Needless to say, Spock doesn't have an easy childhood, as he's always forced to choose between his human and Vulcan halves. This drives a wedge between him and his dad, and the two drift apart. Fast forward even more to the Sarek episode, which I just talked about, where Sarek reveals his regrets over how he treated his son during an intense mind meld between him and Captain Picard. Okay, got all that under your belt? Great, because now we can get to the actual plot. One that's filled with both funny and touching moments, which I'll highlight as we go along. It all starts when Picard learns that Spock, who by this time is an ambassador, seems to have defected to the Romulan Empire. He then visits Sarek, who's now lying on his deathbed, and learns that Spock may be working towards reuniting the Vulcans and Romulans. Not long after the visit, Sarek dies. So, after securing a cloaked Klingon ship, Picard and Data head to Romulus to find out what's what. And suffice it to say, their guest room isn't very inviting. The two then disguise themselves as Romulans and venture down to the planet, hoping to meet one of Spock's contacts. Eventually, they're discovered and taken hostage, only for their kidnappers to turn out to be part of a Romulan underground, where they finally meet Spock. Needless to say, Picard has an awkward time having to tell Spock that his father died, and that Sarek loved him but could never say it. Anyway, Spock explains he is undertaking an unauthorized mission to reunite the Vulcans and Romulans. Meanwhile, while all of this is going on, Riker and the gang are having their own little adventure. The crew tracks a Vulcan deflector stolen by the Ferengi, and the search leads them to a ship junkyard where the manager reveals that several Vulcan vessels have turned up missing. The trail then leads them to a space bar where they hope the smugglers will turn up. Riker gets the guy to talk, who admits the Romulans are involved. Perfect timing, for Picard and Data discover that Spock's been double-crossed. The Romulans plan to use the peace envoy of Vulcan ships as a Trojan horse to conquer Vulcan via sneak attack. But even after being captured, Spock and Data manage to send a coded signal to Riker to warn him about the ships, which he intercepts. Back with Spock and company, they do manage to escape their guards, and ultimately Spock decides to stay on Romulus to still try and work towards peace. And in a touching final scene, Picard mind melds with Spock to share Sarek's final moments with him. As much as I like both parts of this story, Part 2 is definitely when the really interesting stuff starts happening. Part 1 was mostly setup. But for how much drama, humor, suspense, and surprises it gives us, it could have never been contained in one episode, especially considering how poignant the title of the story is. This wasn't just a unification of Vulcans and Romulans, but also of Spock and his dad finally making amends, and two eras of Trek, the original and Next Gen, uniting to give us a very memorable episode. Number 4. The Measure of a Man. I'll just say it right now, Data was one of my favorite characters on Next Gen. His entire story arc throughout the whole run of the show was the exploration of just what it truly meant to be human. And this episode, hands down, brings all those questions to a head as the android's very existence is put on the line. It all starts when a cyberneticist named Bruce Maddox wants to disassemble Data to make duplicate androids for Starfleet, but Data refuses to submit to the experiment. But Maddox soon gets a ruling that since Data's a robot, he's Starfleet property and not a real person, so Picard decides to battle this out in a court of law. But to make things even worse, the insufficient legal staff at the starbase forces Picard to argue against Riker as Data's defender. This story is nothing short of tense and suspenseful, as the very question of what makes a sentient being is argued back and forth. A lot is revealed about Data and what makes him tick, including even where his on-off switch is. Even more gripping is the fact that Riker is forced to argue against one of his best friends and try to prove that Data's nothing but a machine. He takes off one of his arms, then even turns him off completely. But just when all hope seems lost, Picard realizes that Maddox's plan for an army of androids without rights would amount to slavery. So in the end, Picard wins the case for Data when he argues that all beings are created but not owned by their creator in a finale testimony that's unforgettable. Number 3. Relics. Like I said earlier, any episodes that found ways of bringing back characters from the original series were instant faves for me, and this one's no exception. This one also seems to be a favorite among a lot of the fans, and it's easy to see why. It's a classic case of someone feeling out of touch with the rest of the world before finding a new sense of purpose. And out of all the original characters who made a comeback on Next Gen, the hero of this tale arguably got the happiest ending. The story begins when the Enterprise crew discovers a Dyson sphere, which is an artificially constructed habitat built around a star. They also find a shuttlecraft crash landed on the sphere and investigate, and what they find is one survivor kept alive for over 70 years in molecular limbo within a transporter loop. And just who do they rescue? None other than the engineering legend himself, Montgomery Scott. But it quickly becomes apparent that Scotty's now a temporal fish out of water, and most of the tech he's familiar with is now obsolete. And it doesn't help that he and Geordi get off on the wrong foot. So he heads off to the holodeck to recreate the original Enterprise bridge, and what follows is a pretty touching moment between him and Picard. Meanwhile, the crew is still checking out that downed shuttle, so Picard has Scotty help Geordi with the mission. But things take a turn for the worse when the Enterprise is drawn inside the Dyson sphere. But thankfully, it's Scotty who figures out a way to open the sphere's doors long enough for the Enterprise to escape, and then a split-second beam out when the shuttle explodes. In the end, Scotty is given his own shuttle, and the proverbial torch is passed as the old engineer gives his blessing to the new one. Number 2. Disaster. Star Trek meets the Poseidon Adventure. That's pretty much what this episode is. And it's a shame that people tend to breeze past this episode because it's got a lot of great moments, and it's kind of a unique episode in that it's actually got almost 5 different stories going on at once. And all of them have to do with fish out of water scenarios, and that nearly all the main characters have to deal with situations they normally never handle. It all starts when a catastrophe strikes the ship without warning, causing a massive power failure, a total disruption of communications, and almost a complete shutdown of its systems. All the main characters are either injured or separated from one another, and from there we bounce back and forth between a handful of little mini-adventures. 1. Geordi and Dr. Crusher are trapped in a cargo bay with some radioactive canisters that catch fire. Eventually, they decide their only hope of putting out the fire is to blow the airlock, which also exposes them to the vacuum of outer space. 2. The disasters weaken the magnetic containment field surrounding the ship's antimatter pods, and a colossal explosion could occur at any moment. And since Troy, Ensign Rowe, and O'Brien are the only ones on the bridge, Troy is now suddenly in command of the ship, and she faces a tough decision. To save the lives of everyone in the saucer section of the ship from the explosion that could occur at any time, she'll have to detach the saucer from the drive section. But the problem is that because communications are down, they have no way of knowing if anyone is even still alive in engineering. So, does she split up the ship and doom half the crew, or try to reach engineering and risk blowing up everyone? That leads into 3. Riker, Data, Worf, and Kiko, O'Brien's pregnant wife, are treating the injured when Riker and Data decide to try and make their way towards engineering to restore power. And the only way they can get there is through the Jeffrey tubes. They then get stuck in one of the tunnels by an electrical current, so Data's forced to sacrifice his body but not his head so they can move on. After finally reaching engineering, Riker uses Data's head to tap into the ship's controls, restore power, and fix the damaged containment field, meaning that Troy doesn't have to separate the ship. Then we've got 4, back with Worf and Kiko. Her unborn child decides it wants to be born now, and Worf finds himself having to become a midwife for this lady. For the curious, don't worry, the baby was born just fine. But by far, my favorite is the 5th and final story. 3 little kids won a science fair contest, and as their prize, Captain Picard has to give them a tour of the ship, which wouldn't be so bad except for the fact that Picard isn't really that fond of kids. The 4 of them are in a turbo lift when the disaster happens, and Picard ends up breaking his ankle. Now trapped in the lift, the captain has to learn how to keep the scared kids calm, so he assigns them honorary crew member ranks. Eventually, he decides their only way out is to climb the ladder up the shaft, but the kids refuse to leave without him. So, let's add all this up. We've got a Klingon delivering a baby, a guy running around with a severed head, a captain babysitting little kids, and said kids and a counselor having to make life or death command decisions. Where is this episode not awesome? Seriously, this story deserves much more credit for giving us action, suspense, tense moments, sweet moments, and even some funny moments, all adding up to a truly unique adventure that provides a bit of character development for 3 of the main characters. And my number 1 favorite episode of Star Trek The Next Generation is The Hunted. So, Yeah, kind of an odd choice, isn't it? There's no main villains or any real villains at all, really, and no special guest stars, so what made this episode make it all the way to the top? Well, let's find out. The Enterprise is visiting Angosia 3, a planet applying to join the Federation. Everything seems to be going smoothly until a guy named Danar escapes from a lunar prison colony, and that's when our crew discovers a nasty skeleton in the planet's closet, the treatment of its war veterans. As it turns out, Danar was one of many people who volunteered to become soldiers in one of the planet's wars years ago. He and the rest of his fellow patriots were then turned into killing machines through the use of chemicals and mind control. For the most part, the guy is pretty peaceful, but if he's threatened or set off in any way, his fighting instincts will kick in and he'll hurt or kill anyone who gets in his way. And the prison he escaped from was a colony built for the super soldiers who couldn't readapt to civilian life. The Prime Minister of the planet tells Picard the problem's an internal affair and he shouldn't get involved. But just as the crew is about to hand over Danar, he escapes custody and sets off what has to be the longest cat and mouse game I've ever seen in any episode. And this is where it gets awesome for me. I just love the whole scenario of how one man can send the entire crew on a wild goose chase around their own ship. And you feel a bit sorry for Danar since what happened to him wasn't totally his fault, to the point that I actually found myself rooting for him a bit. Danar eventually escapes the ship, then sets his fellow veterans free so they can storm the capital and demand proper treatment instead of being locked away and forgotten about. The Prime Minister pleads for Picard to help, but instead the captain reminds him that he said earlier to stay out of the planet's business, so Picard and the crew beam away, leaving the Prime Minister to solve the problem he created himself. And this is where the story gains another coolness point. Any other day, that stupid Prime Directive rule about not getting involved with non-Federation planets always holds back or hinders the crew in trying to help less advanced planets. But just for once, the Prime Directive not only allows the crew to make a fast getaway, but to also force the planet to solve its own problems. The other reason this made it to number 1 is the poignant lesson in what soldiers go through and how the government, no matter what country you're from, should try to help these people more in their transition back to peaceful civilian life. And despite everything he did, Danar remains a sympathetic character. In fact, he's actually the only one-episode-only character I can remember the name for. We're at the end of the list, and already I can't recall what the names of the aliens were and who watches the Watchers or the scientist guy from The Measure of a Man. But Danar, I'll never forget. Tense and suspenseful, this story more than deserves the number 1 spot. The Hunted, my pick for my favorite episode. I'm Cartoon12, and I hope you enjoyed the countdown. I'll have more top 10 lists real soon, so tune in again.